Okay. Hello, everyone. Looks like I made a little mistake initially with scheduling this meeting. I had it scheduled for 2:30 in the morning, and not right now. So I fixed that, so everybody should be able to access this. Apologies if you hopped online at 2 a.m. I mean, I hope that my error was apparent given the class times given in the course outline, but still, I apologize if anybody got up in the middle of the night to attend lecture. I will make sure not to make this mistake going forward. So today, what we're going to do is make our way through some important ideas in Kim Chapter 1, which is just entitled Introduction. So let's get the old screen share going and begin our lecture properly. So, chapter 1 is sort of meant as a survey. Let's see, where should I put myself? Maybe over here for now. So, chapter 1 is a survey of important ideas. Important concepts. Oh, no, okay, we'll put ourselves over here then. Uh, Important ideas, important concepts that we will want to know about as we make our way through the rest of the textbook. So we're going to be looking at some key figures, but mostly we're going to be concerned with terminology today. This material that we cover today, by the way, will be the material featured on your first quiz, which will go live next week on Monday. So I, of course, encourage everybody to take notes. Normally, I have my slides available well in advance. This was not the case for this lecture. Kind of last minute getting to these slides because the last time I taught this course, I thought I would try a little experiment. I thought I would try and lecture without PowerPoint slides. And it did not work. Apparently, I cannot keep a lecture on track without slides. So I went and created these, but again, for the rest of the lectures, slides are already prepared. So they'll be available well in advance. And what I recommend that you do is print out the slides, because these slides, since this is an online class, the slides also kind of double as my lecture notes. So you can print those out. You can print them out as they are, or you can print them out, with the little note spaces to make notes beside them. Make your notes that way. Or make your notes whatever way is easiest for you. Don't try and exhaustively copy everything I say. Just copy important information to help you recollect it later. Of course, you can also make notes and annotations in your textbook, whether you have a physical copy or a digital copy. Speaking of notes, I do have an announcement which I will push on. I will push out on Brightspace as well as the Discord server, but I'll say it now. We are looking for a volunteer note taker in this class. So what does a volunteer note taker do? They take really good notes and they share them with note-taking services. And students who have academic accommodations such that they need supplementary notes, then they get access to those notes and they get to use those to help them study. Now, one interesting thing about doing this is that it goes on your co-curricular record. Your co-curricular record is kind of like a transcript for extracurricular activities like volunteering as a note taker, or indeed volunteering as something else, or extracurricular activities, right? All of that goes on your co-curricular record. And these are really cool because not only is it a record of all the extracurricular stuff you do, it's something you can use for scholarship applications. Scholarship applications tend to go a little better when you have some kind of extracurricular stuff on your CV. So that's something to think about. Okay, so let's examine some important ideas from chapter 1. Kim starts out by talking about how we categorize different kinds of things. We categorize things that exist, beings. Now, I'm a being, you're a being, but my desk is a being, my guitar, which is off screen over here, is a being, my plants, all of these are beings. They're all things that exist. And we categorize these beings in many, many different ways. We categorize them, for example, um, along, the dimension of animacy versus inanimacy, right? Things that are alive versus things that are not. And of the things that are alive and not alive, we categorize them further. Dogs and cats and humans and horses and so forth are all things that are alive. So are trees. But trees are different than animals. Trees are plants. There are lots of things that are not alive. Furniture and rocks are both inanimate, but furniture is artificial, rocks are not. So we have all kinds of ways of carving up, uh, carving out categories for the kinds of things that exist. This is kind of what we call ontology, the study of beings or being itself. What we're doing in this class, to a great degree, is working with things that we categorize as having minds. These are things that think, perceive, and act. And that's what we're interested in here, as opposed to things which do not have minds. And of all the things that have minds, we tend to think of ourselves in a sort of privileged way, right? Kim writes on the very first page that we are apt to regard ourselves as occupying a special and distinctive place in the natural world on account of our particularly highly developed mental capacities and functions, such as the capacity for abstract thoughts, self-consciousness, artistic sensibilities, complex emotions, and a capacity for rational deliberation and action. This is anthropocentrism, right? We do tend to think of ourselves as somewhat special. And indeed, I would say that we are. That doesn't mean that we're the only thing that's special, but we are special in that way. As I mentioned in our introductory lecture, right, during the course overview, I mean, the contemporary understanding is that the brain is what underwrites the mind. The mind is what the brain does, if you like. The mind is realized by the brain and the nervous system. And the human brain is one of the most complicated things in the known universe. And indeed, we know of no other creature that can use language the way we do, or creates art the way we do. But that's not to say that other kinds of things do not have minds. A lot of creatures certainly have minds. I've got just a few examples here on the slide. Certainly our closest animal cousins, the great apes, definitely are thinking, feeling beings. Other kinds of mammals, certainly, oh, I've got elephants twice there. Whoops. Well, you can never have too many elephants. So elephants are highly intelligent, as are cetaceans. That's whales and dolphins. Dogs and cats are certainly thinking, feeling beings. Dogs, for example, can understand intentional gesturing, right, in ways that, for example, cats can't. I can point. You can try this yourself if you have dogs and cats. I've done it many times. You can point to where you want your dog to look, and chances are your dog will look where you're pointing, and your cat will simply ignore you or glare at you evilly. So all these things have minds beyond question. It used to be that well, some philosophers thought that they did not. Rene Descartes, for example, who we'll meet later in this chapter and also in our next chapter, thought that animals were automata, machines, like robots. He called them beast machines, bête machine. My French is bad, so apologies for the terrible pronunciation there. We don't countenance that view now, at least most thinkers don't. But we do know that there are creatures, beings rather, that do not have minds at all. Trees and plants, most people think do not think, although there is some disagreement about this. Bacteria do not have minds. Viruses do not have minds. But sometimes it's a little hard to tell, right? I mean, does something like a beehive or an anthill work as a collective mind? Maybe. This is an idea that we call extended cognition or group cognition. What about a very simple creature like an earthworm? Or indeed, talking about bees and ants, other kinds of insects. Do they think? Maybe, but probably not to the extent that mammals do. They're probably not as cognitive or as mental as creatures like humans or great apes are. But plants, what about plants? Is the sunflower thinking and perceiving when it tracks the sun across the sky? This is called heliotropism, and it's a characteristic that many plants have. Um, Sunflowers will track the sun across the sky and then kind of close up at the end of the day, right? Are they thinking? A Venus flytrap has little hairs that have to be, two of these hairs have to be tapped within 20 seconds of one another for the plant to close around an insect in its flower. If the timing is off, or if only one hair is tapped, it won't close to save energy. Is that a cognitive process? Is that a perceptual process? It's a kind of a fuzzy boundary, right? What about some kind of advanced AI running on a computer or embodied in a robot? Could we say that it thinks? Maybe. Uh, the answer depends on your theoretical inclinations. Taylor says, I hope not. Well, yeah, you wouldn't be alone in that sentiment for sure. There are worries about what an AI might want to do with us were it to gain intelligence or perhaps even super intelligence, right? I myself would argue that computers are cognitive, that they already do think. However, um, they certainly don't think in the same way that we do. And then, of course, that completely that's not even getting to whether we could have a conscious machine, right? That's a different thing. So, yeah, what kind of things could have a mind, could not have a mind? Sometimes the boundaries on what we assign mentality to are still a little fuzzy. But what we're interested in this course is things with minds, of course. Yeah, we wouldn't want them to be autonomous. There already are autonomous vehicles, autonomous weapons, um, and yeah, we're kind of already pushing we're kind of on the bleeding edge of this stuff right now. It's quite interesting. Um, Thomas, good question. I would say that that's intelligence. You can measure intelligence that way. How intelligent are you? That might be defined in terms of how well you cope with novel situations, which would involve making decisions about certain things. But thinking, not to get ahead of ourselves, thinking is by and large understood in terms of information processing. That's a very cognitive science kind of answer to the question. Kim doesn't really do a whole lot with that, but we will learn about the theoretical underpinnings of the idea that cognition is information processing today, and indeed throughout the rest of the course. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So Kim says, surely simpler creatures have sensations, we think, for they react in appropriate ways to noxious stimuli, and they have sense organs through which they gain information about what goes on around them and adjust and modify their behavior accordingly. But do they have minds? Are they conscious? Do they have mentality? What is it to have a mind or mentality? And I have added that emphasis there. That is one of the questions that will occupy us throughout this course. Certainly, even simple creatures like insects do this. You know, I was taking my dog outside last night, and I often see, you know, little earthworms crawling around in the dew in the nighttime. And you know, if I step close to them, they feel the vibrations and they kind of go like whoop, right down into their holes real quick, right? So they respond to stimuli. The birds outside, they seem to respond to stimuli. They hang around when I put bird seed in the bird feeder. If there's no bird seed, they don't hang around, right? Um, Will says to have a mind, it must have intentions or a desire to reach certain goal states that expand beyond mere sensory perception and reaction. Yeah, and a lot of people would agree with that. To be fully cognitive, you can't just be reflexively or instinctually responding to the environment like the worm. There has to be some kind of mediating mental state, right? And we're going to learn about ways that we can understand those states starting today. So good point. So what is it to have a mind? Well, that's what philosophers of mind are interested in. We ask fundamental questions about the mental, like what is it to have a mind or mentality? And Kim himself, who's coming from a very, you know, like analytic philosophy sort of perspective, he thinks of philosophy of mind as defined by a set of problems or a set of questions, if you like. And one of those questions is, of course, what counts as mental? And another question concerns the relation between mental properties and states, um, and how those are all interrelated with one another. Can we think of some mental properties or mental states now? You'll find I do this a lot. I try not to be boring and read right off the slides. So I'm going to kick the question over to the class. I need a mental state, any mental state, or a mental property, any mental property. You can use the chat, but you can also raise your hand and talk if you wish. Yeah, pain, excellent. Pain is definitely a mental state. Intention, yeah, like having an intention to do something, like a volition, is certainly a mental state. Dreaming is a mental state. Absolutely. It's a very mental state because it happens offline from the world, right? Your brain builds an experience when you're dreaming anyway. Your brain builds an experience based on what's in here and not what's out here. Unlike the experience my brain is generating now, which is dependent upon what's happening out in the world. Yeah, psychosis, certainly a mental state. We could even more specifically say it's a psychological state if we wanted to. Intuition, for sure, mental state. Joy, yeah, joy is an emotion, and emotions are at least partially mental. Some people think they might be fully mental. Nowadays, most people think of emotions as embodied, but certainly there is a mental component to emotions. Awareness, yeah, absolutely. Fatigue, yeah, I would say that that's like a feeling, and we experience our feelings because we're conscious. Consciousness is a mental state. Withdrawal, yes, I would say so. Um, Confusion, yep. All of these are, yeah, great job. All of these are mental states. It's hard to think of a state. Well, we can think of lots of states that are non-mental, like sitting in a chair. Right now, I have the property of sitting in a chair. That's not a mental state. But my intention to sit down or to get up from the chair, those are certainly mental states. So great example. Those are all really good. There are, of course, other mental states that are going to take more of a priority than some other ones, right? We're going to talk a lot about beliefs and desires. We're going to talk a little bit about intentions and emotions too. Um, but then there are lots of other kinds of mental states, like you know, judgment, arriving at like an aesthetic or an evalu or a moral judgment, like judging that you know, this song rocks, or this act of thievery is morally wrong, right? These are also mental processes, mental states, but we won't be concerned with them as much as we will beliefs, desires, intentions, volitions, and emotions. So, yeah, what counts as mental and what are the relations between different mental states? And also, what is the relationship of the mind to the body? This, out of all the questions I mentioned so far, is probably going to be the most central question for Kim throughout this book. In fact, the book is kind of bookended with the mind body problem. We start by mentioning it here, and we're going to go into it in very great detail next week on Monday when we look at chapter 2. And we're going to end with consciousness in the mind body problem. That's the final chapter of this book. So, what is the mind body problem? Well, it's the question of how the mental and the physical are related to one another. What do you think of the mind body problem? Or more precisely, what do you think about the relationship of the mental and the physical? Taylor says they're twins, fundamentally different beings. Okay, that reminds me of dualism, substance dualism, or perhaps property dualism. Mind is like the action and the body is the reaction. Okay, that's an interesting way to put it. Like the mind is almost like the controller or the pilot, and the body is your machine. Yeah, interconnected. I like that. That's like 4E cognition, right? Cognition doesn't just take place in the head. We're also embodied. Cognition is embodied, extended, embedded, and enacted. We'll get to that later on in the course. Jack, you've raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I think there's something super appealing about a very reductive approach, philosophically speaking. And then I kind of live my life, and I'm like, well, this doesn't really make any sense. And I think that's the super fascinating thing about philosophy of mind for me is there's like as Kim puts it, there's just this really strong intuition that they're different things and they can't really be reduced. At least not in like everyday life. It doesn't seem like that's the case.
Yeah, that's the way it seems to us. I mean, like I'm going to say on an upcoming slide, I think a lot of us, in the words of Susan Blackmore, are natural born dualists. Our intuitions tend to point us toward some variant of dualism, that the mind and the body are different things. But this may not be the case. And as you say, reductionism is appealing. And when I said earlier that most people think that nowadays, most by people I mean philosophers and cognitive scientists, most of them think that the mind is dependent in some way on the brain. The mind is perhaps reducible to the brain. And we'll outline a couple of ways we can make sense of that idea shortly. Um, Venance, please go ahead. And I hope I'm saying your name correctly.
Oh yeah, I said it perfectly. Uh,
Excellent.
my idea is of an emergent property. The mind
Mm.
is an emergent property of the brain, but more to say more on it is the mind is an interface of the inner mechanisms of the brain.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting. Yeah,
that's what
kind of like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
what I was getting to is it shows the conscious process to the user, and the subconscious is not perceived. It is negated.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of what Daniel Dennett said, something to the effect of the mind being the brain's interface for itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Yeah. And emergence is really cool. I hope we have a chance to talk about that as we proceed. But the basic idea there is that um, if the mind is an emergent phenomena, it's something more complicated emerging out of the simpler interactions of neurons and synapses and things like that. We will certainly try and talk about this more as we go through the course. Yeah, Nurmith, that's one idea. There are problems with that idea, but yeah, that is what I was kind of saying when I said that the mind is the pilot and the body the vehicle. Um, I always make the I make the analogy with the giant robot. Like I don't know if we have any anime fans in the class, but if you've seen any of those giant robot anime, You can think of your mind as the pilot of the giant robot and the body as the giant robot. There are problems with this. Yeah, Pacific Rim, great example, right? In fact, in Pacific Rim, I think they have two pilots because one pilot is kind of like one hemisphere of the brain. It's interesting, right? But yeah, giant. Think of a giant robot that you're the pilot of. There are problems with this, which we'll get to later on in the course, but that is one way to think about it. So, Kim says that a simple answer might go like this: the mental seems prima facie so utterly different from the physical, and yet the two seem intimately related to each other. Yeah, I think we would all agree with that. That is the way it seems. They're so different, yet so integrated. So Kim is gesturing at the mind-body problem. That is the challenge of explaining how the mental is related to the physical. And I think you can see why this is a problem. We are physical beings. We have bodies made of matter, brains made of matter, and events in the environment, which are also physical events, they can affect our nervous system, which causes physical changes like nerves firing, which gives rise to physical changes in the brain. And this gives rise to mental events. Like imagine stubbing your toe. That's a physical event causing physical changes in your nervous system, causing physical changes in the brain, causing you to experience pain. But how does that work? How does something physical cause something mental? And if something physical can cause something mental, then can it happen the other way around? Can mental events cause physical events? Right? Could my belief that I'm hungry, I feel my stomach rumbling, so I form the belief based on my perception of what my body is doing, that I'm hungry, like grumble, grumble. Oh, I must be hungry. So I desire to satisfy my hunger. Okay, so my belief and desire interact in such a way that they cause me to get up, go to the kitchen, and make a sandwich because I have the further belief that, there are things in the fridge I can make a sandwich with, and eating a sandwich will satisfy my hunger, and so forth, right? Is it really the mental events causing that? Or is it all just physical events in the brain and my consciousness is, just kind of an epiphenomenon? It's real, but it doesn't have any causal effect on the physical. That is what Kim will argue as we make our way through the book. And this is related to a problem that is closely connected to the mind-body problem, and that is the problem of mental causation. Can mental events cause physical events? How do physical events cause mental events? If mental events can't cause physical events, what does that mean for free will? Right? So you can see how this has some wide-ranging implications. Placebo effect. Sorry, Natalia. What? An example of what exactly? Of a mental state or of the mind-body connection? I think just if I'm recalling my line of conversation, I imagine that you're referring to the mind-body problem. And yeah, I would say the placebo effect is an interesting problem because, yeah, I believe I've taken a medicine. Say I have a headache, and you tell me here is an aspirin, but it's actually just a sugar pill. So I take it. I believe I've taken medicine, and then I start to feel better. That seems to be an instance of the mental affecting the physical, right? So yeah, very, very interesting example. Taylor has some things to say, says, doopa says, drug addiction, dopamine searching. Yeah. Of the mental effect affecting the physical. Yeah. That is if epiphenomenalism turns out not to be true. But yeah, people do get addicted to drugs. That's definitely a physical thing affecting your mentality. Dopamine searching might be like, I do this when I'm marking papers where, I mark 2 or 3 and then I start getting bored. So I go have a cup of coffee, play a game of chess, and then get back to marking, right? Because I'm bored and I want to alleviate my boredom, right? Not that marking papers is that boring, but when you have hundreds of them, it can get a little crazy. Kim says a mental state like feeling sad or somber can cause a physical event like getting up. Yeah. Well, that's the idea. And we want to know whether it really is the mental event that's causing the physical event or whether the mental event is merely an epiphenomenon. But again, this is a question for our chapter on mental causation. But you're right, that's a good example of that. Would unconscious behavior prove that the mind isn't always a necessary component? Yeah, absolutely. In fact, there's some very interesting neuroscience studies by a fellow named Benjamin Liebe that were done in, I think, the early 80s, early mid 80s, if I remember correctly. And he found that when it came to making simple movements like flicking your wrist or, something like that, the activity in the neural cortex, the unconscious activity in the neural cortex, in the motor cortex that initiates the movement happens before your conscious intention to move, which is kind of scary, right? Means we might be zombies or robots. So we'll get to this. This is very exciting. We'll get to talk about this a lot more as we make our way through the book. What about sleep deprivation? Noah's asking about sleep deprivation. Could that affect your physical state? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you know how it is when you have a night where you didn't get adequate sleep. I find like if I don't get enough sleep, and I'm the kind of person who needs a lot of sleep, but if I don't get enough sleep, I have trouble thinking, right? Like I'm not as fast. My working memory isn't as good, right? It's not beauty sleep, it's thinky sleep. I need my thinky sleep. Otherwise, I think my IQ actually drops a few points if I haven't had a good night's sleep, to be honest. And yeah, decision making, it can absolutely impact your decision making. You can make bad decisions when you're tired. Being really sleep deprived might be equivalent to being intoxicated in certain cases. Feeling tired and falling asleep, yeah, sometimes you want to stay awake, but you can't. You just fall asleep. You're so tired that you're out. It's happened to me. Sometimes I'm so tired I fall asleep on the couch. And then my partner has to be like, "Where are you?" "Oh, he's fallen asleep on the couch. Better wake him up." Yeah, Jack, you're not wrong. Yeah, many of these could be explained in terms of physical cause. And that's the problem of mental causation. What's doing the causal work? Is the mental doing some causal work, or is it all just physical stuff? Like that's the problem, right? So yeah, you're absolutely right. That is a possibility. And when we look at mental causation, Kim will argue for epiphenomenalism. He will argue that that mental events are real, but they don't cause anything. When I say causal work or causal power, I mean the ability to effect change, to make something happen. So, if we think of like physical causation, we're talking about like your billiard ball causation, right? I strike the cue ball with my cue stick and it hits the 8 ball, which rolls into the corner pocket, right? That's physical causation. A causes B causes C. In this case, I am an agent who's affecting the cue stick, doing the causal work, or I have causal power to use the stick to move the cue ball to strike the 8 ball, and so on, right? That's what I mean by causal work, causal power, or causation. I'm talking about something making something happen to something else. So good question. I'm glad you asked that because I actually did not put that in the slide. So it's good that we had a chance to clarify that. Things like this, by the way, like my little spiel about what causality is, things like that are fair game for our quizzes, right? So that's why it's important to take notes. Let's look at some metaphysical preliminaries. Boy, we are really moving along through this work, through this book, through this chapter, which is great. Maybe we won't go the full 3 hours today. That's fine. But let's look at metaphysical preliminaries. What is metaphysics? Metaphysics is the study of reality. The word metaphysics comes from Aristotle, all the way back in the day. Aristotle, 2,200 years ago, whenever it was, Aristotle wrote a book about nature called The Physics. Physics, our word for physics, comes from the ancient Greek physis, which just means nature. So Aristotle's book, The Physics, was about the natural world. And then he wrote a book called The Book That Comes After the Physics, Ta Biblio Ta Meta Ta Physica. Probably my ancient Greek is a little off there, but that means the book that comes after the physics, Meta Ta Physica. So that's metaphysics, and it deals with other phenomena that might exist. Nowadays, when we ask about metaphysical things, we don't mean what like the new age hippie people mean. We don't mean spirituality. We don't mean aliens and astral projection and crystals and whatnot. And when philosophers say metaphysics, they mean the study of reality. And they ask questions like what kinds of things exist? And of the things that do exist, what are they like? So minds exist, we all agree on that. But what are minds like? That's a metaphysical question. Is free will real? That's a metaphysical question. Are numbers real? Also a metaphysical question. Like, what are numbers? Do numbers exist in nature, or did we come up with those? Right? What else? What else? How does consciousness work? Does my consciousness give me causal power to affect the world? Or is it all just physical stuff in my brain and my consciousness is an epiphenomenon? These are metaphysical questions about the mental. So we'll review some of the metaphysics now, the metaphysics of the mental. Now, we're going to talk about this a lot more next time. But if you're somebody like Rene Descartes, the early modern thinker who is, he's often called the father of modern philosophy in the European tradition. He wasn't just a philosopher, he was also what we would today call a scientist, as well as a mathematician. You've heard of the Cartesian plane, right? Who remembers in high school you had to do graphs, right? X-axis, y-axis, y equals mx plus b. Maybe you had a graphing calculator. Oh man, where's my graph? I actually have a graphing calculator somewhere around here, but I don't know where it went. Oh shoot. Remember these? Y equals mx plus b. So I wonder if this still works. I don't know why I have this. I'm such a nerd. So that plane, that's the Cartesian plane. Descartes invented that. How do rainbows work? Descartes explained it. Like, how does the light scatter and create all the colors? Descartes was the guy who came up with the theory of rainbows and was the first guy to really explain how it worked. So Descartes was a serious scientist. In fact, in his day, we didn't call them scientists. We didn't have that term. We called them natural philosophers. They were doing philosophy about the natural world. So Descartes was a scientist or natural philosopher, if you like. He believed that when it came to minds, having a mind amounted to having a soul. And the soul is a thinking thing. It's made of thinking substance, res cogitans. And it's a fundamentally different kind of thing than what trees are made of, or what the body is made of, or what rocks are made of, or coffee cups. Those things are made of extended substance, res extensa. And these are two different kinds of finite substances. This view, this kind of dualistic way of looking at things, I said earlier, we're all kind of like natural born dualists. We're naturally inclined to look at the world as populated by material stuff as well as minds. right? And if you go all the way back, you go way back in human history, you'll find that many humans were animists. They even looked at the world as alive and thinking in the same way that we ourselves are. And this is where you get, talk of like gods and spirits and stuff from, right? But this goes all dualism, at least as we understand it today, goes at least back to Plato. And Plato was really one of the first people to articulate a view of the body as sort of a corporeal, corruptible material substance, and the soul as a sort of spiritual substance, um, which actually Plato believed would survive the death of the body and eventually be re-embodied, kind of like reincarnation. He called this the transmigration of the soul. If you want to read more about this, I would highly recommend his dialogues Meno and Phaedo. You can sort of get it in Plato's own words as he tells it through the character of Socrates. But they're both dualists. Descartes and Plato were both dualists. But Descartes says the soul is a thinking substance. In fact, most philosophers right up probably until the 18th or 19th century, well, definitely by the 19th century, up until then, philosophers didn't talk about minds. They talked about souls. The soul was the thing that thinks and perceives and acts. That's what it is. If you are ever curious about learning more about how this came to be, the lectures from my first year seminar, Minds and Machines, are on my YouTube channel. And that's what that course is all about. How philosophy went from the mind as soul to mind as machine, like a computer. So, it's not like obligatory, but it's there if you want it. Venance, go ahead.
Just out of curiosity on that, uh, I found it interesting how it goes from soul to mind. I would think, would it not be a consequence of language, uh, how we transition from interpreting?
I think partially, the way we use language certainly changes over the years, but it also reflects the concepts that these thinkers are working with, right?
Okay.
I
Yeah.
mean, for Plato, you had your soul, which was psyche or suke,
Hmm.
and then you had the intellect, which they called nous. But both of these words are still kind of reflected in our modern day terminology, like psychology, the psyche from suke, soul. Now we
Oh,
mean mind, but uh, Plato understood it as the soul, and the soul had properties like reason or logos. Um, uh, yeah, so it's not just language, but also how we're thinking of these things.
okay. Another quick one.
Yeah,
So Plato is psyche and soul and intellect two distinct substance?
I'd say soul is the substance, and then
Yeah,
logos and nous are things that substance has. We could say that they're attributes of that substance.
perfect.
Yeah.
All right, got it. Thank
Yeah, and I should say a little something about what a substance is. Um, a substance, there's various definitions in philosophy, but one is a substance is like a kind of thing that can stand on its own, a kind of fundamental thing that exists out there in the universe. Another way to understand substance is, and this is the way Kim understands it, is as something to which properties adhere. So in this case, mind might have the property of thinking and being unextended, right? If you're a Cartesian. Um, Descartes thought that the soul intersected or intercommunicated with the body in the head, in the pineal gland specifically, which is a gland in the middle of your brain. Plato thought that the part of the soul with logos is in the head. The part of the soul, the spirited part of the soul, thumos, was in the chest, and the appetitive part of the soul, eros, was in the gut. So Plato actually divides the soul into three parts, and he places them in different parts of the body, which is interesting. It's funny. It reflects a sort of embodied way of looking at things, right? Um, the mind, the thinky part is in the head where the brain is. Although that's not to say Plato understood what the brain did. He didn't. Um, but the spirited part of the soul, the part that deals with emotions and passions, is in the chest, and that's where you feel your heart beating. That's where you feel your breathing speed up and slow down, right? And of course, the appetitive part is in the gut, where you feel things like hunger, right? So it's interesting the way Plato does that. Now, very important, most philosophers nowadays reject the Cartesian view. We'll examine this in greater detail next week, but most philosophers are not substance dualists. Most thinkers would endorse something like this. They would say, as Kim does, having a mind can be construed simply as having a certain group of properties, features, and capacities that are possessed by humans and some higher animals, but absent in things like rocks and trees. It is less misleading, therefore, to speak of mentality than of having a mind. The surface grammar of the latter abets the problematic idea of a substantival mind, mind as an object of a special kind. So it's not like a mind is something I have, but I am a mental type of thing. Having a mind implies that the mind is, if you would analogize the mind with the soul, then it's like if the body is a machine, the soul is the ghost in the machine. And these are the words of Gilbert Ryle, who was very critical of the Cartesian outlook. Gilbert Ryle famously said he characterized Cartesian dualism as the dogma of the ghost in the machine. But even then, it's not like my mind is in my brain. No, my mind is realized by my brain, perhaps, but my mind is not in there, right? If you open up my skull and poke around in my brain, you won't find my mind. You're not going to be like, oh, there it is, right? That's not how it works. It's a category mistake to do that. And that's kind of what Ryle was getting at as well. But you will find that there are people that identify the mind with the brain. These are our identity theorists. There are those that also say, let's forget about the brain. We actually don't need to worry about the brain. What we need to worry about are the information processing steps and how informational states are related to one another, and so on. What are the functions of the mental system? Those are what matter, not how it is physically implemented or physically realized. And we call these people functionalists. So functionalists would say, of course, you could have a mind in a non-human animal can have a mind, even though their brains are different than our brains. A computer or a robot could have a mind, even though they don't have a brain at all. Because what matters is how the system functions, not what it's made of. The identity theorist would say, no, 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 that's wrong. You need a brain. If you don't have a brain, you don't have a mind, because the brain mental states are identical to brain states. In fact, functionalism actually emerged to deal with some of the problems of physicalism, and we'll learn about that as we go along in the class. But those are some important ways to think of it. You've got your substance dualism, you've got your identity theory, and functionalism. That's not an exhaustive list, by the way. We will learn more ideas than that. To a certain extent, but the question is whether, functionalists believe in something called multiple realizability. And that's what I was gesturing at earlier. The idea that, I can implement a mind in multiple physical substrates. It doesn't have to be a brain. Sure, the brain might play some role in how my mind is realized, but that doesn't mean there's any barrier in principle to having an artificial mind, say. It's kind of like this, right? Like, let's say I want to do a mathematical operation. I could do it on a calculator. I want to do 2 + 2 = 4, right? Something simple. What kind of calculator do I use? Well, it doesn't matter. right? I could use this really cool graphing calculator, obviously, right? Super powerful graphing calculator. You can actually play like Super Mario on this if you mod it. I have not done that with this, but it is possible. You could use a virtual calculator, like the calculator that one has on their phone or computer. Here we're talking about circuit boards and everything is kind of hardwired in. But with a computer, it's a virtual calculator. Or I could use an abacus. All of them can implement the mathematical function 2 + 2 = 4. The information processing steps are what matter. They're all made of different things, and that doesn't matter. They're all still calculators, right? That's multiple realizability. All right, let's talk about a little bit of terminology. We want to talk about substances. Substances is something we'll talk further about in the next chapter. But substances, the way Kim is going to discuss them, are things to which properties can adhere. So I can have a substance, maybe matter. Say matter is a substance, physical substance. And it could have properties like being cylindrical and hollow with a handle on the side, and such that I can fill it with coffee, right? And it can have relations with other things in the world. It can be on my desk, right? These properties can be related to one another in certain ways as well. We call properties and relations together attributes. So those are some important terms to keep in mind. The previous concept, is that multiple realizability? That's the idea that a mind can be realized or implemented using different stuff, air quotes, right? So a mind can be realized by a human brain or by a non-human animal brain, right? The brain of my dog is quite different from my brain, but we both have minds. Or I could implement a mind in a computer, perhaps. And what matters is not what it's made of, but the information processing steps that are happening within the system. That's functionalism, and that idea that we can implement minds in different kinds of stuff is multiple realizability. We have a whole couple of chapters on this, so don't worry. We will revisit this. We're also going to talk about mental events and physical events to a great extent in this course. We'll talk about mental states and mental processes, and when possible, we'll talk about facts about the mental. So, one important idea is mind-body supervenience. It's very important to keep mind-body supervenience in mind. I'm not sorry about the pun. Kim uses the example of the transporter from Star Trek. So is anyone familiar with the transporter from the Star Trek franchise? I hope so. Good. Yes. Beam me up, Scotty. That's right. Old school. Scotty's a guy. Why is Scotty, it doesn't make sense. Scotty's doing the beaming. Scotty's the engineer. He's down there in the engine room. Why is he doing the beaming? I don't know. Taylor's not familiar, but don't worry. It's basically the idea is so on Star Trek, you're out there in your spaceship, you're Star Trekking along, you want to go down to the planet or to another spaceship. So you take the transporter. And what the transporter does is it basically breaks you down, destroys the molecules in your body, turns them into energy, beams that to wherever you're going, and then puts you back together. This was actually conceived of because in the original like 1960s Star Trek series, they didn't have the budget to constantly have them taking little shuttles from here to there. So they thought, well, why don't we just have this matter energy transporter that just beams you there? So it actually grew out of budget constraints. Nowadays, that's not a problem, but the transporter is one of the things that Star Trek is known for. And all kinds of crazy stuff happens with the transporter on Star Trek. sometimes you get duplicated, right? So in the original series, Captain Kirk gets duplicated in a transporter accident. And so there's a good but meek and passive Kirk and an evil Kirk. And then they have to figure out how to beam them back together, right? What are some other good ones? The Next Generation, Star Trek The Next Generation. Commander Riker finds out, Cass, that's right. He finds out he got duplicated. One of them is left on whatever planet that they don't even go back to for like a decade, while the other continues his life. And then they meet each other and they're like, "What? No, I'm Will Riker. No, I'm." It's like the Spider-Man meme, but Star Trek. And yes, of course, Tuvix, who gets murdered. I'm so glad everybody knows about Tuvix. Yeah, Tuvok and Neelix get merged and begs for his life. But Captain Janeway says nope, and straight up murders Tuvix. So there's lots of crazy transporter hijinks that can go on Star Trek. Think of an example like the Kirk example or the Riker example, right? Maybe you get duplicated. Oh, geez, Jacob, that's a really hard question. Um, Good question. The original series is probably the place to begin. Yeah, you can start with the newer movies. Although they're technically like the J.J. Abrams movies are technically a different timeline, but they feature like the same characters and stuff. So it's kind of like I would say, an orientation to the franchise. If you want to go chronologically, you have to go Enterprise, first two seasons of Discovery, original series, Next Gen, DS9, Voyager. What are the other ones? Strange New Worlds is in there. Yeah, because there was like there's been like three eras of Star Trek, right? There was the original series and the animated series and the movies. Then there was Next Gen, DS9, and Voyager and Enterprise, and now there's like Discovery, Strange New Worlds, Picard, and Lower Decks. I'm sorry, guys. I'm a really big Star Trek nerd, so you're gonna probably hear about this. Nicole, I agree with you. Next Gen is a very it's kind of like, I think, the most representative. Um, the first season is weird. Okay, it's really weird. But around season 3, it becomes like peak Star Trek and stays there. Um, yeah, TNG is good to start. Um, DS9 is amazing. Voyager is great. I really loved Enterprise. I also like the new stuff. A lot of people are like iffy about the new stuff, but there's some stuff I really like about the newer stuff. I really love Lower Decks. Actually, I think that's probably my favorite. But anyway, let's say you're beamed and you're taken apart, turned into energy, sent over to planet whatever, and you're put back together. So that's a physical copy of you. Whether you're duplicated or not, the transporter is kind of like a copy of you. So, whoops, I've gone past this duplication thing. So let's say you've duplicated yourself, or you've just, either Commander Riker style where there's two of you, or you're just beamed, you're taken apart, so destroyed, converted to energy, beamed over, converted back to matter, so that whatever ends up on the other side is a physical copy of you. Would that duplicate also have all of the same mental properties in addition to the physical ones? If you say yes, then you probably endorse mind-body supervenience, the idea that the mental supervenes upon the physical. And by the way, you might have heard of this philosophical zombie thought experiment, which is related to transporter cases like the one we're considering here. A philosophical zombie is a creature that is physically identical to you, but which doesn't have consciousness. If you can imagine such a creature, and that's conceivable to you, then that means that you think that consciousness is something special. You're probably a dualist of some kind, right? But if you don't think that's possible, if you think that a creature that's identical to me or you in every way physically must also be mentally identical, then you endorse supervenience. So mind body supervenience thesis number one, as Kim presents it, is the mental supervenes on the physical in that things, objects, events, organisms, persons, and so on, that are exactly alike in all physical properties cannot differ with respect to mental properties. That is, physical indiscernibility entails psychological indiscernibility. So that's the first formulation of the mind-body supervenience thesis. And that's the idea that the mental kind of supervenes on the physical such that wherever there are physical properties, there will be mental properties that supervene on the physical. In fact, that's what we start to get in this formulation of the supervenience thesis called the strong supervenience thesis. Identical twins. Yeah, I'll go back a slide, Taylor. Right here, this slide. Also, identical twins. Well, identical twins aren't exactly identical. There are subtle differences in the way that their brains develop and in as they live in the experiences that they have, such that even though they're genetically identical, they're not physically identical. You know, maybe one twin falls over and scrapes their knee and they have a scar on their knee, the other twin doesn't. One twin goes to the zoo on the twin's birthday, and the other stays home because they're sick. They're forming different neural pathways, different memory engrams. So they're not actually physically identical on a sort of microscopic level, like a transporter duplicate or a philosophical zombie would be. Yeah, like imagine if I could copy myself. If I get into a machine and it scans me and then boop, makes another one of me that's like an exact clone of me. It should also be conscious. It should also have mental states. It should also have all of my memories, right? We would diverge from that point on, right? In the metaphysics of identity, we call this a duplication case, right? So once I'm duplicated, I'm two different people. But the point is that my copy being physically identical to me should have mental states, right? Like that's the idea. Okay, so the strong supervenience thesis says that the mental supervenes on the physical in that if anything X has mental property M, there is a physical property P such that X has P, and necessarily any object that has P has M. So philosophers do this a lot, right? Especially analytic philosophers. They write in these sentences that have these sort of logical variables in them so that we can fill in whatever properties we want. But here, X just means an object. I could be X. So Josh has a mental property of belief that Ottawa is the capital of Canada. So there will be a physical property that I have, namely some kind of brain state, perhaps, such that I have that brain state, and any object X, any other person that has the brain state P also has the belief that Ottawa is the capital of Canada, right? Do you see what I mean? This is stronger because because of the way it's formulated. The strongest claim of all is mind-body supervenience 3. This is global supervenience. The mental supervenes on the physical in that worlds that are alike in all physical respects are alike in all mental respects as well. In fact, worlds that are physically alike are exactly alike overall. So imagine if you were some kind of godlike being and you could duplicate this entire universe. That's what we mean by the world, by the way. When philosophers say the world, they don't mean like just our world, the planet Earth. They mean the totality of existence. They mean the universe, the cosmos, right? The ordered whole of everything that is. That's what we mean by the world. So imagine you're like a godlike being and you create a copy of this universe. It's physically identical in every way. Well, then the creatures in it, like me and you, should also have minds. They should have mental properties. Well, it depends. It depends what explains qualia, right? And that's kind of the point of the philosophical zombie thought experiment, right? If you can conceive of a creature that's physically identical to you, but without consciousness, without qualia, then the mental must not supervene on the physical. It must be something extra, something special, maybe like a soul or a completely different kind of substance, right? Maybe, but we don't need that to be the case. Maybe because of quantum uncertainty, the two universes would unfold a little bit differently. But if you were to duplicate this universe as it is right now, then in the duplicate universe, there should be a creature, duplicate Josh, lecturing to you, and that duplicate should have all the mental states that original Josh in the first universe has. That's why it's called global supervenience. Two is stronger than one because it's formalized a little bit better. And let's actually here we can actually go to the textbook. So page 9, and we'll see why Kim says that it is stronger. Page 9 here. Okay. Now it's stronger because strong supervenience logically entails the first supervenience formulation, right? The first thesis, the first supervenience thesis, depends upon strong supervenience being true. And that is why 2 is stronger than 1. But 3 is the strongest of all because it's talking about the entire universe. It's the strongest one of all. We are not going to really be too concerned with the third formulation, but we will be quite concerned with the second. Well, do I believe in a multiverse? I don't know. Actually, I don't know if I believe in a multiverse. Maybe. I don't know if I believe in if there are just lots of universes, or if it's more like a sort of like Rick and Morty sort of multiverse where, like some interpretations of quantum mechanics where everything that could possibly happen does happen in one universe or another. I don't know. It's not very, the idea of a multiverse is not very parsimonious, but I'm not a physicist, right? Really though, questions about multiverses are metaphysical questions, right? So yeah, I guess philosophers can weigh in on this. But I'm not sure what I believe, to be honest. I haven't really thought about it too much. But I think it would be kind of cool if there were other universes. What would they be like, right? So would global supervenience result in the duplicate creatures acting out the same way? If all things were exactly the same, then wouldn't there be a high chance that future events? Yeah. I mean, some would say that. Some would say, determinists would say that, for example. They would say, well, if the conditions are exactly the same in each copy of the universe, then things should unfold the same way. But indeterminists would say, no, maybe there's some quantum randomness in there, which makes it so that once they're split, they each develop differently, and one universe starts to look more different from the other the longer time goes on. So the answer to that question depends on what you believe, whether you're a determinist or an indeterminist. And we'll have a chance to talk about determinism, by the way, later on in the book. Yeah. So this is why I just want to kind of make this clear, right? 2 is stronger than 1 because 2 is like kind of formalized and it entails 1. So the idea, Jill, I'll answer your question in just a sec. The idea is that this formalization entails or implies this This is kind of just in plain language, and this is a little more formal. So that's why 2 is stronger than 1, and 3 is the strongest of all, and it's called global because it's about the world. But the world doesn't mean the planet Earth. The world means the cosmos, the universe. Okay, now Jill's question. Let's go back to the chat. Another example of supervenience, the second supervenience thesis. So you can take anything you want. You could say, let's make X a robot. And let's say that the mental property is a belief again. And there's a physical property such that our robot has this physical property. So maybe a string of ones and zeros. That's the physical property. Ones and zeros implemented by switches that are on or off. So any object that has that physical property will necessarily have the corresponding belief. Yeah, does that help? Or can we try and generate more examples? If anyone in the class wants to generate an example, that's welcome as well. But Jill, does that help clarify that? Kind of. Okay. Yeah, it is very abstract. Just remember, so before I come up with another example, just remember that these are variables, right? So X is some being, a human, an animal, a computer, a robot, whatever. And the mental property is M. Mental properties would be beliefs, desires, emotions, intentions, volitions, things like that. And physical properties would be like states of the brain or states of the computer. So let's say I have a memory of going to the zoo. My memory that I was at the zoo. I will have a physical property of my neurons being organized in such a way that represents my memory of being at the zoo. Any creature that has those same physical properties will have that mental property. In fact, maybe I could become a mad scientist and I could rewire your brains and connect up your neurons exactly like my zoo memory neurons are connected. If I did that, I'd be giving you, X, the physical property P. And as a consequence, if supervenience is true, you would then gain my memories of going to the zoo. Crazy, right? So that's another example of supervenience. And again, this will become clearer as we proceed. I mean, this idea of mind-body supervenience is abstract. It's very abstract. But the simple if I can make it as simple as possible, it is that wherever you have a certain physical property, you will also find the mental property. Yeah, or to use speaking of pain, the example that often comes up is your C fibers firing. So these are a kind of neuron, and they fire, they activate a lot in quick succession when physical damage happens. So you could say that the physical property is having your C fibers firing, and the mental property is being in pain. That's like literally the textbook example. It would it be 1-to-1? Well, not if you're a functionalist. If you're a functionalist, you believe that pain is multiply realizable. So maybe there are aliens that don't have C fibers. They have very different physiology. They have like I don't know, like a Zorp globbers or some made up alien term. And when their Zorp globbers are flarbing, then they have pain, right? I'm sorry I just made all that up, but that's multiple realizability. Could the mind body supervenience relate to humans in the real world and humans on social media? I don't think so. So well, we could say that these properties don't supervene in social media, I guess. It might, to clarify things, it might help to think of things to not think of a mental example. You can think of something else like color. Okay, so check this out. Got my cube right here. So let's pick a color, say red, right? Now red, bees, I'm not sure this, no, I don't think this really applies. Here, color example will help clarify. So take a color like red, okay? So let's call this, let's just call this a color property, okay? Being red. Now, of course, this color supervenes on a particular wavelength of light that's reflecting off the surface of my cube and reaching my eyes, right? This color is not out there in the world. It's not real. It's a mental representation. But the wavelengths of light are real. They are out there in the world. And whenever you see this particular wavelength of light, you will see the color red if you look at it. So we could say red supervenes on those wavelengths of light. Does that make sense? You could also, if you wanted to, think of it in terms of like aesthetic properties or moral properties. Okay, Angelica, go ahead.
My question is, based off your example about red supervening on certain wavelengths of light, doesn't then supervenience have to do with more of the perception of the person viewing the object or the theory as opposed to the actual theory or object itself?
In some cases, yes. So, like I was about to mention, moral and aesthetic properties, and those are subjective to the extent that we need a being with a mind to perceive them. Same with colors, right? So the only difference here is when it comes to supervenience of the mental, we're talking about mental supervening on the physical, that being the mind itself. But the idea is the same, where, you know, we can say that red supervenes on certain wavelengths of light. We could say that the aesthetic property of beauty supervenes on certain physical properties like nice colors or symmetry or something like that. We could say that the moral property of, like moral wrongness might supervene on something like physical harm, right? Um, it's just a way of saying that whatever property supervening is kind of like over and above the physical property. Okay, here's a good one. My dog X has mental property M to bite people. I would say a desire to bite people, and a physical property P, dog body. Then does that any object that have a dog body have M? No, I would say that here the physical property needs to be a brain state. So say your dog has the mental property, which is a desire to bite the mailman. Then your dog is also going to have a physical property like a mental event that causes the dog to bite the mailman. And any other dog that has the same mental property or same physical property in the brain, the same brain state, will have the same desire, namely to bite your mail delivery person. So yeah, that's getting there. We just have to specifically relate when we say physical states when it comes to supervenience of the mental on the physical. We're talking about mental states like beliefs and desires, and brain states like neural networks and their firing patterns. So anyway, like, don't worry if this is not super clear yet. It is quite abstract, and it will become clearer as we make our way through the course. So let's see, how are we doing for time? Does anyone want to take a 10-minute break now that we've now that we have wrecked our brains talking about Star Trek and supervenience and etc.? Okay, why don't we take a 10-minute break? We'll come back at 4 and we'll finish everything off. Sound good? Excellent. I'll see you all in about 10 minutes.
A few moments later.
Okay, everybody, it's been about 10 minutes. So let's get going again. Share the screen and go back to the slideshow. So I think this is about where we left off. I should have paused this, but I'll cut out the 10-minute break when I edit this to upload it for those who want to watch it later. A couple of important things to know about are, well, one important thing really, physicalism. Materialism is merely the historical antecedent of physicalism. And most philosophers of mind nowadays are physicalists, which means that when it comes to substances, there is only one kind of substance, physical substance, the stuff that exists in the natural world, right? You know, matter, energy, things like that. Kim says, materialism is the doctrine that all things exist in the world, or all things that exist in the world, are bits of matter or aggregates of bits of matter. There is no thing that isn't a material being, no transcendental being, so no God or gods, no Hegelian absolutes, no immaterial minds, so no thinking substances, as Descartes proposed. Physicalism is the contemporary successor to materialism. Why is it that we now employ physicalism as opposed to materialism? What do you think? Care to take a guess? You don't have to guess. I've kind of hinted at it here in the next point, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Why do you think that philosophers opt for a term like physicalism over materialism? Jack, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, basically just what Thomas said, but there's things that are physical that aren't made of matter or aren't material. Like there could be physical, I guess, depending, according to some people, physical things that are immaterial.
That's right. Like Thomas said, gravity. Gravity is real. And by the way, when we say real in philosophy, we mean things that exist out there in the world. So we mean basically mind independent properties. Yeah, Jack, great point. Holes, right? Holes are an absence of material, right? But they're real. They do exist. But if you go and find a hole, you're going to find it's not made of anything, right? But it is a physical phenomena. And so that's why we use physicalism now, because, you know, materialism came out of the Enlightenment. Yeah, darkness is another example. It's a real phenomenon, but it's just not light, right? So in the early modern period, you know, with thinkers like Descartes, Thomas Hobbes was a very famous materialist thinker as well. Descartes is a materialist when it comes to physical stuff, but not when it comes to the mind. The mind is non-material. But Descartes' res extensa, his extended substance, that is material. And materialists like Hobbes, other thinkers like Galileo, Copernicus, Isaac Newton, you know, a lot of those natural philosophers that we now group in with scientists would have been materialists. And they thought everything could be explained in the natural world as matter in motion. And the motion of that matter, its behavior, is governed by laws, natural laws. Physicalism expands this to include other kinds of physical properties. So like, you know, something like a gravitational field or an electromagnetic field, right? Or something as simple as darkness or a hole, right? These are real things. They're physical, but they're not material, right? Gravity isn't made of matter. Rather, gravity is, you know, if you're like, you know, following Einstein, gravity is the way that mass affects space-time, but it's not made of matter. Gravity is an effect upon matter, and as well as space. Is gravity antimatter? Well, no, antimatter is still material. Antimatter is like regular matter, but it has the opposite spin and charge. So an electron is matter. It has a certain spin and it has a negative charge. The antiparticle is called a positron. So it has a positive charge and an opposite spin. That's antimatter. So gravity's not antimatter. Gravity is the way that mass shapes space-time, such that, you know, if I go around the planet Earth, I might get caught in its gravity, and I'm in its gravity well, and I just kind of circle the planet in a perpetual free fall, right? Or if I go really fast, if I go close to the speed of light, or if I go close to a really, really massive object like a black hole, the speed or gravity will affect me in such a way that time will slow down in my reference frame, right? But none of this is matter, right? It affects matter, but it's not made of matter. So that's why we say physical. And some physicalists say that there are even other properties besides physical properties, like non-physical properties, like moral properties, so rightness and wrongness, aesthetic properties, beauty and ugliness, mental properties, beliefs, desires, intentions, etc. And all of these non-physical properties, if they exist, supervene on the physical properties. Yes. Yes, it's called relativistic travel. So if I went, let's say I wanted to go to a distant star system, and it's, I don't know, maybe it's a couple light years away, right? So I've got a long trip ahead of me, and maybe I go, I don't know, I get up to like 50% of the speed of light. Time slows down for me. It's actually a thought experiment you can do. It's the twin thought experiment. So one of my twins stays on Earth, and then I go into space, and I take my ship and I go 50% the speed of light to Alpha Centauri or someplace, right? And then I come back at the same speed. When I get back, I will have aged less than the twin who's left on Earth. And that's because of something called time dilation. And it is pretty cool. And again, it doesn't just happen when you're going very fast. It also happens when you are near a very massive object. So if I'm falling into a black hole, I would appear, you know, to slow down to the people observing me. But from my perspective, everything would start going really, really, really fast. Yeah, it's like the movie Interstellar. It is proven. We have actually had very sensitive clocks, like atomic clocks, that are so sensitive because they measure time via atomic decay. When some element decays into a simpler element, like a radioactive element decaying into a non-radioactive element. And these are very precise timekeepers. And what we'll do is we'll have one on Earth. We'll have two on Earth. And we'll start them, and then we'll keep one on Earth, and we'll put one in orbit a little bit farther away from the center of gravity of the Earth, and then we'll bring it back. And the clock closer to the gravity actually goes at a different rate than the one farther from the center of gravity. So yeah, it is proven. It's very, very far out. And this was, if you want to, you know, I'm not a physicist, so my expertise on this kind of ends here. But you know, this is what Albert Einstein is famous for. This is one of the reasons why he was so famous, is because his theories of special and general relativity explained this. And we actually proved it by looking, we had to wait. It was this crazy experiment we had to do where we had to wait for a solar eclipse and look at how the light of a distant star was affected as it was bent around the sun due to gravitational lensing. So they had to like wait for a total solar eclipse and then go to where the eclipse was and observe it and see if the star looked, you know, here or here in the photographs. Very cool stuff. Yeah, physics is awesome. I wish I knew a little bit more about it. I mean, I know like some pop physics, but I'm not a physicist myself. So I mostly know physics so that I can talk about the metaphysics. Yeah. Very cool. Yeah, it is mind-boggling. Now, the point is that these non-physical properties, like moral properties, aesthetic properties, and mental properties, are taken by many philosophers to supervene on the physical properties. So, physical property maybe if you have let's say that you have like a nice symmetrical face and large eyes, right? These are physical properties. The property, at least, which may, arguably to a certain extent is kind of a social construct as well, but the property of beauty, we would say supervenes on those, on things like symmetry or something, right? But of course, these properties actually can vary in different times and places, right? In ancient Greece, a unibrow was considered a very attractive trait. Nowadays, not so much. But in ancient Greece, we might say that physical attractiveness supervenes on the property of having a unibrow, if you want, right? So that's an example. So a lot of philosophers would say that the supervenience thesis affirms something like this. They would say many philosophers, as Kim says, regard the supervenience thesis as affirming a relation of dependence or determination between the mental and the physical. The mental properties a given thing has depend on or are determined by the physical properties it has. And this may also entail, in fact, as I mentioned, Kim believes this entails epiphenomenalism, which is the idea that physical properties can cause mental properties. So light waves affecting the rods and cones in my retina can affect nerve signals going to my occipital cortex and so on and so forth. And those can cause a mental event like seeing a red circle. But mental events cannot cause physical events. Again, don't get too hung up on epiphenomenalism right now, because we will be spending quite a bit of time talking about it as the course goes on. But this also may entail something like mind-body dependence, which Kim says, or which Kim formulates like this. He says the mental properties a given thing has depend on and are determined by the physical properties it has. That is, our psychological character is wholly determined by our physical nature. And this implies what Kim is calling minimal physicalism. Everything mental depends upon the physical. In this case, what I mean by the physical are one's brain and one's nervous system. And of course, beyond that, how physical events in one's environment affect the nervous system and the brain. Kind of like I said before, the example of pain, the C fibers firing. Maybe I burned my hand. This happened last semester. I had a very severe burn on my right foot when I was making ramen late at night. And sleepy as I was, I carelessly moved the pot of boiling water a little too fast, which is also a case of the physical affecting the mental because I was quite sleepy. It was very late. Anyway, the boiling water touched my foot and caused tissue damage, which caused my C fibers to fire, which caused me to experience pain. So that's minimal physicalism. My experience of pain depends upon the physical. Yeah, I was limping. Remember, I was limping around pretty bad for a little bit because I got that swelling happening there, the pitting edema, they call it. Not to get into all the gruesome details, but all healed up now. But yeesh, yeah, I think that that was, be careful when you're cooking. I like to cook a lot, but it just goes to show you that you can never be too careful. It's when you're working with hot water and fire and frying pans and whatnot, you've got to really be mindful of what you're doing with yourself. So that's minimal physicalism. And a stronger formulation would be substance physicalism, which is the idea, as Kim says here, that all that exists in this world are bits of matter in space-time and aggregate structures composed of bits of matter. There is nothing else in the space-time world. So we have the only kind of substance that exists is physical. There might be non-physical properties, moral, aesthetic, mental. Yeah, that's fine. There might be, well, there wouldn't, there's no might be about it. There would certainly be physical properties, but as far as substance goes, it's just physical substance. Nothing else exists. And if you are a physicalist, that's what you would say. You're a substance physicalist. And by the way, this is a kind of substance monism, which is the view that there's only one kind of substance. We will encounter different kinds of substance monism as we proceed. Another kind of substance monism is, for example, subjective idealism. So this comes from a philosopher called George Berkeley. It's spelled Berkeley, but it's pronounced Barclay. And he was a subjective idealist, which means that the only substance that exists for him is mind. So no, not everything is made of matter. There is no matter. Everything is made of mind or idea. All of this is mental. This mouse is not made of matter. It's an idea. It's kind of like, if you're Berkeley, you believe that God is sort of dreaming up the entire universe. So the whole universe exists within the mind of God. And everything in the universe is thus idea. So God kind of acts as the guarantor of reality. And that's why when, like, if I leave this room and come back, it'll be the same way it was before, because God is always perceiving everything everywhere. But a physicalist would explain it by saying that, well, there's just physical stuff and it just didn't change while you left the room, right? So substance monism, there are different types. Subjective idealism is one that says that everything is mental, but substance physicalism says that everything is physical. The only stuff that exists is physical stuff. And there are additional kinds of dualism besides substance dualism as well. So substance monism says there's one kind of substance. Substance dualism says there are two. In the case of Descartes, extended substance and thinking substance, or matter and mind. But property dualism, or non-reductive physicalism, says that, I quote, the psychological processes of a system are distinct from and irreducible to its physical properties. So my mental property of believing that Ottawa is the capital city of Canada is a separate property from my physical property, which would be my brain state, perhaps. And my belief is dependent upon, but not reducible to, those physical properties. So that's non-reductive physicalism. The only stuff that exists is physical stuff, but there are other properties, like mental properties, and we cannot reduce the mental to the physical. Reductive physicalism, or type physicalism, on the other hand, says, and I quote, that psychological properties, or kinds or types, are reducible to physical properties, which are kinds or types. That is, psychological properties and kinds are physical properties and kinds. There are only properties of one sort exemplified in the world, and they are physical properties. So this is type physicalism, and it says that, for example, if I have a type of mental state like belief, that is just a type of brain state. That's all there is to it. We can reduce the mental state to the physical state. We can even eliminate the mental state. Some people, like Patricia and Paul Churchland, for example, are what we would call eliminative reductionists. So they say, like, let's not just reduce the mental to the physical. Let's get rid of the mental altogether. We don't need it. Why talk about beliefs and desires when we can just talk about brain states and neurons firing and those kinds of things, right? So that's reductive physicalism. And this particular type physicalism, says that every type of mental state is reducible to a type of physical state. A different formulation is token physicalism, which says that each token of a type of mental state can be reduced to a token of a type of brain state. And the reason why we do token physicalism instead of type physicalism is that type physicalism doesn't quite work because our brains are all different. I can't have the exact same type of mental state that you have because our brains are different. But if each of us believes that Ottawa is the capital of Canada, then each of us has a token of a type of a brain state. So a type is like a kind, and a token is a particular example of that kind. So belief would be a kind, And my belief that Ottawa is the capital is a token of that type. Your belief that Ottawa is the capital is a different token of that type. My belief that Ottawa, that it's raining in Ottawa is a different token of a type of belief. You see? Anyway, don't worry too much about these details. We will fill all of this out as we proceed. Let's talk about varieties of mental phenomena, just to get some terminology out of our way. These are all, well, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are all kinds of mental phenomena that we can have. We can have sensations, right? These are mental events that are caused by how the features of the world impact our sense organs and our nervous system. So I can sense hot and cold, light and dark, things like that. There's also a subjective, phenomenal, or qualitative aspect to my sensations, and we call these qualia, or singular quale. Philosophers will sometimes employ the terminology that qualia are what it's like to experience something. They're the unique subjective felt qualities of our experience. The smell of coffee. You'll see me drinking a lot of coffee. But you know how coffee has that kind of bitter, roasted, delicious smell? And that smells nice, but that's not what hot chocolate smells like. Hot chocolate smells like hot chocolate. These are qualia. The redness of a rose is a quale. The blueness of a clear summer sky is a quale. So we can have sensations, and these sensations are all often accompanied by qualia, but not everything has qualia. And then of course, there are mental states that we attribute to people, including ourselves. And these are usually linguistically formatted, and they feature a that clause or a proposition. So we call them propositional attitudes because they're attitudes we take toward propositions, sentences that are about the world that feature a that clause, which may be true or false. So a propositional attitude might be belief. I believe that it is raining. Well, actually, it might not be raining. Scratch that. I believe it is not raining. So Josh believes that it is not raining is a propositional attitude, belief. Desires are propositional attitudes. We say that they're intentional. These are intentional states because they have intentionality. That is, they have content. Beliefs and desires and other mental states, other propositional attitudes are always about something. They have content. There are moods and emotions. These are intentional. These are mental states. They're also probably pretty embodied, but don't worry about that right now. Moods, by the way, does anyone know the difference between moods and emotions? Moods are kind of long term, and they're not intentional. Moods aren't really about anything. But emotions are episodic, and they're always about something. You know, if I'm just feeling depressed for no particular reason, or I have a really good sleep and I get up and I just feel really chipper just because, that's a mood. But if, you know, I experience an episode of happiness because someone tells me, hey, Josh, surprise, I brought you a pizza, and I get happy, well, that's an emotion because it's episodic, it's short term, and it's about something, namely surprise pizza, right? We can also have intentions or volitions, right? These are also pretty propositional. Like if I decide that I'll have pizza for breakfast, that's propositional. And you can see that because there's a that clause in there, right? And there are other mental phenomena as well. You know, maybe character traits and personality traits. We could talk about things like intelligence, talents, habits, other dispositions. These are mental states as well. So this is a sort of list of mental states that we can talk about. Does anyone have any questions about mental states and the associated terminology before we flip to the next slide?
Sir, I can't see your slides.
Oh no. Is anyone else having that problem? Why can we not see them? Huh.
Oh,
Weird.
maybe I clicked out. How do I get back to those? Sorry, I thought you were just talking. Now I feel like I
Oh
missed
no.
something.
There should be like a screen that shows my screen, and if you can full screen that screen, I'm actually not sure how to do it from the student side because I'm I'm on I'm the presenter, right? So I'm not quite sure how.
I got it. I think, yeah, I was at the top here. Okay, thank you.
Ah, okay, perfect. Good, good. Well, any questions about mental state terminology before we proceed? Okay, it looks like from the lack of questions that everybody's good. So we'll go ahead and see if we can get everything finished up here. Now we're going to round out the chapter by talking about the mark of the mental and whether there is a mark of the mental, an indicator that could tell us what it is to have a mind versus what it is to not have a mind. And over the years, and I mean over the years, over the centuries, philosophers have wondered about whether they could identify a criterion or criteria that would allow us to distinguish the mental from the non-mental. Now, some appeal to epistemological criteria. And by the way, epistemology is an area of philosophy where we're concerned with knowledge, what it is, how do we get it, how do we know when we have it, and that kind of thing, right? How do we come to know things? How does knowledge work? That's epistemology. It means roughly theory of knowledge or study of knowledge. Epistemic criteria that might serve as the mark of the mental might include something like direct or immediate knowledge. You know, think about it like this. If you have a toothache, you don't need to infer that you have a toothache. You don't have to think about whether you have a toothache or not. You just feel it. So you know you have a toothache. Your tooth hurts, you know you have a toothache. You cannot be mistaken about that. Well, maybe you could actually, but or say I see a red circle, right? Or a blue cube or whatever, maybe a multicolored, got my speed cube right here. It's multicolored. I cannot be mistaken, right? I see the red side of the cube. Well, what color is that? Let's think about it. Let's compare. Yep, red. No, I don't need to do that. As long as my vision is functioning normally, I just see it. I just see the color. So maybe that's a mark of the mental, this direct or immediate knowledge. Are there problems with this, though? What do you think? Venance, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say one of the problems with this would be in terms of hallucination,
Yeah,
mirages, stuff like that.
exactly. Like, what about, like you say, hallucinations, mirages? We could also add perceptual illusions, right?
Yeah,
I can be mistaken. You know, um, there is a sort of there is a way I cannot be mistaken about something. It's called immunity to error through misidentification. I could be wrong that I have a pain, but I can't be wrong about who's having it. So maybe I could be hallucinating that I'm in pain, so I'm not really in pain. So I'm wrong that I'm in pain, but I'm not wrong about whose experience it is. And that gets us to the next thing, that's privacy or first person privilege. The idea that there's a sort of mindness to my thoughts and experiences. I cannot be mistaken about whose thoughts and experiences they are. Yeah, right, Will, unless I'm being deceived, perhaps. Although I don't know, I think Descartes might disagree, right? Descartes would say the demon could deceive me into thinking that I'm in pain when I'm not. The demon could deceive me into thinking that triangles have four sides and that 2 + 2 = 5. The demon could deceive me about everything, but it could not deceive me about who it is that's doing the thinking and having the experiences. So yeah, that's immunity to error through misidentification, and that's something developed by Sidney Shoemaker in his analysis of Wittgenstein's work. And we'll talk about Wittgenstein as we go through the course. But like, I can be mistaken about whether I have a toothache, right? Maybe maybe I don't have a toothache. Maybe what I have is deferred pain from somewhere else. But I cannot be mistaken about it being my experience. So maybe that first person privilege, that mindness, is an epistemic mark of the mental. Taylor, go ahead.
Yeah, just in context of privacy or first person privilege, this one reminds me a lot of like mental health when people say like, you know, my experiences or talking about sort of like how there's like a mindness to their thoughts and experiences. I guess when they're trying to like not convince others, but like educate others on something that they're going through, they're trying to sort of like open up that first person privilege and share with someone. So that
Yeah.
one reminded me of that.
And I think that gets to something else, which we'll run into when we talk about consciousness, which is the problem of subjectivity, right? I mentioned this in our intro lecture. You know, it's kind of like, what is it like to be a bat, right? Well, we'll never know because we're not bats. You can say you're experiencing mental health problems and you try to communicate that to somebody who has never experienced them. It can be pretty difficult, right? I think that people who have not experienced mental health concerns actually have a hard time getting it, right? Like people who have never been depressed don't seem to grasp what it is, right? Like if you talk to somebody who's never been depressed, they're like, don't be sad all the time. And it's like, wait a minute, that's not what depression is, though. You know, it's a different thing than that. So, yeah, trying to expand the boundaries, you know, people do that, as you say, Taylor. It can be difficult because of the problem of subjectivity. I can try and put myself in someone else's shoes or imagine that I am them, but I will never actually be them in the same way that I can never be a bat, right? What about infallibility or transparency? My knowledge of my own mental states is infallible and incorrigible. That means that I can't be wrong about my own mental states. This is a pretty strong claim, by the way. This is what Descartes believed. I'm infallible. I cannot be wrong about my own mental states, and I cannot be convinced otherwise of my mental states. That's what it means to be incorrigible. So in that way, my mental states are kind of transparent to me in a way that the mental states of others are not, right? I could say, you know, how do I know I believe that it is raining? Well, what are you talking about? I just believe that it is raining. Simple. I just know that. But how do I know that my partner believes it is raining? Well, I observe, she's going to the store. She's taking her umbrella. Why would she take her umbrella? Well, maybe she believes it is raining and that the umbrella will keep her dry, right? So when it comes to the thoughts of others, I have to employ folk psychology or mind reading or common sense psychology. There are a lot of names for it. I have to infer their mental states, but I don't have to do that with me because they're transparent to me. So these are some epistemic criteria. You know, they might not work, right? Do I have direct immediate, you know, do I not need to infer that I have a toothache? Well, I could be hallucinating. I could be dreaming, right? There's a mindness to my experiences. But what if a mad scientist altered my brain and implanted an experience in my brain that I didn't have? What if, like I said earlier, he rewrites my neurons and rewires them so that I have the memory of going to the zoo when I never went to the zoo? It would still feel like my memory, but it never happened. Infallibility and transparency? Well, Descartes might not be correct that my mental states are infallible and incorrigible. And are they transparent to me? Freud has entered the chat. He would say, hell no. And most philosophers, even though they aren't Freudians, do acknowledge the existence of unconscious and automatic mental processes that we are not aware of and that are not transparent to us. So maybe there are some problems with these candidates for marks of the mental. Any other questions before we move on to the next one? Well, do you see why these are all epistemic, right? Because they all deal with knowledge of our own minds. So that's why they're all epistemic or epistemological criteria for marks of the mental. So that's the key takeaway here, I would say. Maybe mentality is non-spatial. If you're a Cartesian, you will really be into this one. Descartes thought the mind was a thinking substance, and it was unextended and did not take up space. But the material substance, you know, that the world and the body is composed of, that is extended in space, but it doesn't think. You know, Descartes would deny that a computer can think because it doesn't have res cogitans. It doesn't have thinking substance. It's just made of matter. And Descartes thought the same of animals and the human body. The human body is a machine. Animals are just machines, like automata, like the robots of Descartes' day, basically, like little clockwork mechanisms that just kind of, you know, if you poke them a certain way, they do a certain thing, but it's all just mechanical processes and there's no mind in there. But thinking substance, that's what thinks, but it doesn't take up space. It's like immaterial, like the immaterial soul. So if you're a Cartesian, it would follow that the mental is non-spatial. To take this seriously, as Kim says, you have to take seriously substance dualism, and almost nobody does anymore, at least in philosophy, because there are some problems it raises that it does not answer. He did sort of observe he did observe animals, and I believe he also probably conducted studies on the bodies of animals. He also would have had knowledge from, you know, previous thinkers like Aristotle, for example, did a lot of vivisecting. That is dissecting creatures when they're still alive in order to see how they work. I don't know if Descartes ever did that himself, but if he didn't, he would have had access to, you know, the physiology, the body of physiological knowledge of the day. Yeah. So yeah, Descartes, again, you know, Descartes didn't think the brain was what did the thinking. He thought that the soul was. And the soul might interface with the brain via the pineal gland, but the brain isn't what thinks. So the fact that animals have brains wouldn't have meant anything to Descartes. Yeah. So you have to be serious about dualism to take this idea seriously. And most philosophers, as I mentioned, are not inclined to take dualism seriously. Maybe intentionality is the mark of the mental. This is probably the biggest candidate we're going to talk about today. Remember, mental states have intentionality, this property we call intentionality, and that means that they have content or that they are about something. They have this aboutness to them. Like if I believe that it is raining, the content of my belief is what follows the that. So it is raining is the content of my belief. Whether it is raining right now is what my belief is about. So mental states have content. Same with perceptions. I perceive this coffee cup in front of me. Well, that's the content of my perception. If I desire pizza for breakfast is the content of my desire, right? And you know, these can interact too. This is we'll get into this more when we talk about mental causation and folk psychology, but you know, maybe I believe that I have pizza in the fridge and I also believe that I'm hungry. I have a desire to satisfy my hunger. So I go to get the pizza from the fridge and I eat it. The pizza is the content, right? It's what my beliefs and desires are about. This has come to be known as Brentano's thesis after the Austrian philosopher Franz Brentano, who was the PhD supervisor of Edmund Husserl, the phenomenologist. Oh, whoopsie daisy, I was getting ahead of myself there. He argued that intentionality is the mark of the mental, and he did so by drawing upon, a lot of the medieval stuff, Thomas Aquinas and so forth. He wrote, every mental phenomenon is characterized by what the scholastics of the Middle Ages called the intentional or mental inexistence of an object, and what we might call, though not wholly unambiguously, reference to a content, direction toward an object, which is not to be understood here as meaning a thing, or immanent objectivity. Every mental phenomenon includes something as object within itself, although they do not all do so in the same way. In presentation, something is presented. In judgment, something is affirmed or denied. In love, loved. In hate, hated. In desire, desired, and so on. So this aboutness, what our mental states are about, is intentionality. And Brentano's thesis is that intentionality is the mark of the mental. And we can actually further subdivide intentionality into referential intentionality and content intentionality. Referential intentionality deals with what our mental states refer to, what they're directed toward in the world. So referential intentionality would be like if I have a memory of, my philosophy professor, who is that directed toward? Well, it's directed toward Professor so-and-so, who's out there in the world teaching other philosophy students as we speak. Content intentionality refers to, what is, is the object within itself, right? What is the content of my beliefs and desires of my mental state? So that is the difference. Referential intentionality is intentionality that's sort of directed out there in the world, and content intentionality is what the mental states themselves are about. Has anyone ever seen this? This painting by Magritte, the Belgian surrealist artist. It's called The Treachery of Images. Nice. Yeah, it's a good painting. I love this painting, actually. I like the surrealists and the Dadaists and those guys. I'm not a big visual artist, but I don't get it. Great. I'm really glad, because I will explain it to you. What does it say? What does it say here? Who can speak French or read French? Yeah, it says this is not a pipe. So what is that? What are you talking about, Magritte? What do you mean that's not a pipe? Is it a pipe? What does it mean to say that this is not a pipe? It is what Gandalf smokes with, although Gandalf smokes with a much longer pipe. The type of pipe Gandalf uses is called a church warden. And Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, was a fanatical pipe smoker, which is why he gave Gandalf such a cool pipe and had all the hobbits smoking pipe weed all the time. Yes. Yes. Cass and Venance, exactly. It's a picture or a depiction, or if you like, a representation of a pipe. That's what it means. Yeah, when I was young, I racked my brains. I'm like, what do you mean it's not a pipe? It's definitely a pipe. It's a picture of a pipe. And then I got it. Oh, it's not a pipe. It's just a representation of a pipe. I had a pipe around here somewhere, but I don't have it with me. But if I did, I would say this is a pipe. But this is not. This is a representation of a pipe. So our mental states, by virtue of the fact that they have content, are representational, like Magritte's painting. The content of that painting is a pipe. The pipe is represented in the painting, but it's not an actual pipe. So that's a representation. Yeah, it does make sense, right? And not only is Magritte's painting not a pipe, but a representation of a pipe, but our mental states, our perceptions, thoughts, beliefs, those are mental representations. Yes, Will, exactly. When I look at my coffee cup and I have this experience of perceiving it, that's not the coffee cup. It's a mental representation of the coffee cup. Right? You guys see The Matrix? You ever see that movie, The Matrix? So remember the scene where Neo goes to see the Oracle, and there's that kid who's bending the spoons, right? I thought the new one was actually decent. I thought it was kind of neat the way it subverted stuff. But the original one, where the kid's bending the spoons, and Neo's like, "Whoa!" But then the kid's like, "Don't try to bend the spoon. Try to realize the truth. There is no spoon. It's just a representation of a spoon because they're in the Matrix, right?" It's like that. Or Morpheus, right? You think that's air you're breathing now? No. It's all just a mental representation created by being plugged into the matrix. It's really the same thing here, only the representation is being created from, information coming in via my sense organs. And because mental representations are representational, they have justification and correctness conditions. That means that my mental states can be correct and incorrect, or they can be well justified or not justified at all. That means that I can be wrong. My representations can be wrong. I can have misrepresentations. Taylor, go ahead.
Is this similar to how there was a study where they took a bunch of people and had them watch a video, and randomly in the corner there was like a gorilla hanging out in the corner, and nobody noticed it. So then they were like, they came back and they deduced that, oh, maybe we should have like experts. It was like a tennis match or something with like a
Yeah.
gorilla in the corner. And then they had experts like tennis players watch it, and still a bunch of people missed it because
Yeah.
they are focused on like that one thing. They're obviously looking for something obvious and they're missing something there. Our brains do that a lot. And is that similar to like they sort of
Yeah.
like correct things?
Not exactly. But it is related in the sense that it's a mental phenomenon, but you could ask the question, is the gorilla being represented if no one notices it, right? Will says change blindness. Yeah, it's actually inattentional blindness. What's going on there is, we call this the monkey business illusion. And yeah, basically what these psychologists did is they had like two basketball teams, a red and a blue team or whatever. And the participants are instructed to count the number of passes that one team makes. So they're distracted counting those passes. While they're counting them, a guy in a gorilla suit walks out, does this, and then leaves, right? And so that's called inattentional blindness, because when you're busy doing something cognitively demanding, like counting the basketball passes that the blue team makes, you don't notice the gorilla. So yeah, change blindness and inattentional blindness, really two sides of the same coin. And here an interesting question is whether, did your brain represent the gorilla? And if it did, why didn't you notice it? Because you go back and watch the tape again, once you know there's a gorilla, you're like, how the hell did I miss the gorilla, right? So yeah, there are lots of examples of change blindness and inattentional blindness. I could share some on the internet, but Taylor, I think in my philosophy of the paranormal class, I might have shared something about change blindness when I was talking about magicians. Anyway, Penn and Teller, the magicians, have a really good cup and ball routine where they do the cup and ball routine and then they do it again with transparent cups. And it's a perfect illustration of how inattentional blindness works. And you can find it on YouTube. So just, if you guys want to Google Penn and Teller cup and balls, you'll find it. But yeah, go. Okay, good. I wasn't misremembering. Good. I'm glad I got that right. But what this means is that because our mental states have justification and correctness conditions, I can misperceive things. Sure, I can misperceive there not being a gorilla when there is a gorilla, but I can misperceive, like, oh, that figure over there looks like a man. Oh no, it's actually just the trees, right? So correctness conditions are all about whether your mental representations are representing the world the way it really is. So if I believe that it is raining and it really is raining, then my belief is correct. But if I believe it is raining and it is not raining, my belief is incorrect, obviously. But mental states can also be justified or unjustified. Maybe I believe it's raining and it really is, but what's the evidence I have for it? Well, my partner just left and she brought her umbrella. I can hear a pitter-pattering on the window and on the roof. I look and I see with my own eyes raindrops falling. Well, then I've got a lot of evidence that it's raining, so my belief that it's raining is pretty well justified. But maybe my belief could be poorly justified, even if it's correct. It might actually be raining, and I believe it's raining because I hear the sound of rain. But unbeknownst to me, that's just my partner playing some rain noises for background music while she meditates, right? In that case, my belief could even be correct. It really is raining outside, but my justification is a bad one because it doesn't connect to the way the world is in the right way, right? Can you have incorrect knowledge? You cannot. Usually we say that knowledge is a well-justified true belief. I can have false beliefs, but I can't have false knowledge, right? If I say that, I know that Toronto is the capital of Canada, well, no, I don't know that because it's wrong. I don't know the capital of Canada, right? But beliefs can be right and wrong. Knowledge cannot be wrong. If it's wrong, it's not knowledge. It's just a false belief. Now, a question or questions. How do we decide the mark of the mental? We need to try and understand what all mental properties have in common that unites them as mental, or mental phenomena, rather. What do they all have in common that unites them as one kind of phenomena? Could be intentionality, could be non-spatiality, could be one of the epistemic criteria we looked at. Some say that it's consciousness. To really be said to have a mind, you have to have consciousness. And I agree that consciousness definitely is a mark of the mental, but maybe not all thinking things are conscious. A functionalist might say that, sure, computers can think and non-human animals can think, but computers are probably not conscious, and there are some non-human animals that, while they may be conscious, are perhaps less conscious than we are. Some take this to an extreme and they say that consciousness is everywhere. It's a fundamental property of the universe, and that's called panpsychism. Others say that it's not consciousness, but the fact that mentality is representational in character that is a good mark of the mental. And you don't have to decide what you think right now. We will revisit all of this as we make our way through the class. And it's going to be a lot of fun. So that is all for today. Next time, we're going to look closer at the work of this guy. Oh, he disappeared. This guy. Can I annotate this? Yes. Oh, that's cool. I've never done this before. Look, Descartes, right there. That's Descartes. And we're going to talk about, oh boy, I'm having so much fun with this. Okay. So next time, we're going to talk about the substance dualism of René Descartes. I can even draw. Oh, I can't draw here. So I want you to read chapter 2, Mind as Immaterial Substance. Once you read chapter 2, and please do read it before. Oh, it doesn't stay when that's really weird. Look at that. I'm trying to give him glasses, but it won't work. Anyway, please read chapter 2 before our next lecture, which will take place on Monday at 2:30 p.m. Not 2:30 a.m. I promise not to do that again. And remember that quiz number 1 will go live. Now, quiz number 1 will cover what we've covered today and material from chapter 1. It will feature multiple choice questions, true false questions, probably 8 or 10, and probably 2 short written answer questions. You can. I'm going to reiterate the rules right now, actually. You can refer to the textbook, refer to my slides, or refer to my notes. You cannot copy and paste. You have to type it out in your own words. You cannot use Google because Google can lead you astray. And under no circumstances are you to use ChatGPT. You cannot ask it questions and copy and paste. You cannot ask it questions and put it in your own words because chances are you're going to get it wrong. And remember, I give the quiz to ChatGPT. I know what its answers look like. Do not use it. Okay? Okay. It will be live. I'm going to say probably right after class wraps up on Monday. I'll probably do something like that. Now, one other thing. How do we find the textbook so far before we go? How do we find it? And be honest, if you haven't read the chapter, I won't be mad. Okay, so Nirmith hasn't read it yet, but Thomas says it's dense. It is dense. That's what I'm here for. I'm selecting what I want you to pay attention to. It is a highly technical book. Yeah. Let me be your metaphysical interpreter. Yeah. Yeah, don't worry. That's what I'm here for. So if I do think you should read it before class. And if it's not 100% clear what's going on, that's okay, because that's what I'm here for. So, if you read it and you don't get it, don't worry about it. Bring your questions to me. We'll talk about it during lecture. That's the whole point of this, right? So I do encourage you to read before the class and then bring your questions to me. If you can't and you have to read it after, that's okay. Definitely do read it, though. You do need to read the book. Okay, well, that's it. Are there any other questions before we wrap up? Because that's all I have for today. Savina, go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding the quiz itself. I know you've mentioned in the first class that it's mostly, well, the paragraphs we have to write in our own words in like more than 3 sentences, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So, format-wise, it's basically going to be like short answers or a mix of like multiple choice and short answers.
There's going to be about 10 or so multiple choice and true false, and then 2 short answer questions. And those will be 1 to 2 paragraphs that I expect. And the paragraphs, I would say, like, some people think of a paragraph as like 2 or 3 sentences. I want like 4 or 5 sentences. And again, it's got to be in your own words, just to reiterate. So sometimes you can explain it all in one paragraph, and that's fine. And in the questions, I break down, like, out of what I'm asking you, I'm breaking it down so that you know what parts of the question are worth how many points. So say, for example, I asked, this won't be on the quiz, but if I asked you to explain Descartes' dualism, I would say, like, if the question is worth 5 points, I'd say, like, explain extended substance and thinking substance, and maybe you get 2 points each for your explanation, and then an additional point for whether you agree or disagree with Descartes, right? Something like that. So I tell you the breakdown of the mark in the written answer questions. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Anything else anybody wants to know about? All right. Well, then that's it for today. Oh, yes, that's right. 2 questions, 5 marks each for a total of 10, plus 10 multi-choice and true false for a total of 20 marks. And all of this, by the way, when I set the quiz up, it'll all be, I break it down into sections and it tells you, like, this section has this many questions and they're worth this many marks and blah, 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 blah. So all of that will be there on when you start the quiz. Probably after class ends on Monday is when I'll open it. And then it'll be open to 11:59 p.m. on Friday of that week. Yep. Okay, any other questions? Just shoot me an email, all right? But I will see you all on Monday when we'll talk about Descartes' substance dualism. All right. Thanks, everyone. This was a really fun class. Take care, everybody.